The hiss of steam and the groan of steel were the first greetings Larkspur offered. Abigail Doyle stepped down from the passenger car, her boots meeting a platform of splintered wood and a puff of fine, pale dust that tasted of alkali and distance. She pulled her shawl tighter, a useless gesture against the immense, dry heat of the New Mexico territory. The air itself felt ancient, baked by a sun that bleached the sky to a thin, bleached blue. Behind her, the train sighed a final shuddering breath, the smell of coal smoke and hot metal sharp in her nostrils. Ahead lay the town, a collection of raw lumber buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the vastness of the high desert. In her satchel, 2 pieces of paper represented the entirety of her world. One was the official claim for her homestead, a quarter section of land promised by the government, a piece of earth to call her own. The other was a letter, its edges softened from countless readings. It was the last correspondence from Mr. Alistair Finney, a railroad engineer with a conscience as straight as the tracks he laid. He had written to her of a stolen survey ledger, a book of maps and figures that proved the water rights of the small settlers along the Rio del Bravo. His letter was a warning, a plea, and now, a eulogy. Mr. Finney had met with a mysterious accident just weeks after posting it. Abigail clutched the satchel's leather strap, her knuckles white. Missouri was 1,000 miles and a lifetime behind her, a place of whispers and accusations she had been forced to flee. This raw, sun-scorched land was meant to be a clean slate, a place where a woman's worth was measured by the sweat of her brow, not the venom of gossip. Yet Mr. Finney's letter felt like a ghost from her past, a reminder that injustice wore the same ugly face everywhere. She walked the length of the platform toward the main street, her city-made shoes feeling flimsy and foolish on the uneven ground. Larkspur was less a town and more a temporary argument with the wilderness. False-fronted buildings lined a wide, rutted thoroughfare, a general store, a land office, a smithy whose rhythmic clang echoed in the hot air, and the Silver Star Saloon, from which a tinny piano tune spilled out like cheap whiskey. Dust was the universal element, coating every surface, stirred into miniature cyclones by the passage of a lone rider. It was then that she saw the commotion. Outside the mercantile, a knot of men had formed. At its center, a burly man with a florid face and a dusty bowler hat held a smaller, wiry farmer by the collar, shaking him like a dog with a rat. "You've been told once." "Miller," the big man growled, his voice a gravelly threat. "Mr. McCready's water is for Mr. McCready's land, not for your pathetic patch of beans." "It's the runoff from the main channel, Boone," the farmer pleaded, his face pale with fear and indignation. "It's always been common use. The law says—" "The law," the man named Boone Riker laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He shoved the farmer, who stumbled backward against a water trough. "I am the law you need to worry about today." He drew back a fist. Abigail froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was the casual cruelty that stole her breath, the certainty in the bully's eyes that he was untouchable. Other townsfolk watched, some with averted eyes, others with a grim, resigned set to their jaws. A young man wearing the badge of a deputy marshal stood near the land office, his hand resting on his pistol, his expression a troubled mix of duty and hesitation. He was young, too young perhaps for the pressures of a town like this. Before Boone's fist could land, another figure stepped out from the shade of the smithy's overhang. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and leather, with the quiet, deliberate movements of a man who was comfortable in his own skin and in the harsh landscape. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw a weapon. He simply moved to stand between Boone and his victim. "That's enough, Boone," he said. His voice was low and calm, yet it cut through the tension like a keen blade. Boone Riker turned, his sneer deepening as he recognized the newcomer. "Calder, this ain't your concern. This thief was diverting water." "I know, Miller," Luke Calder replied, his gaze steady. "He's no thief. And I know McCready's fences. They've been creeping wider every season. Maybe you should be more concerned with keeping your own lines straight." For a long moment, the two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Boone was thicker, heavier, but there was a coiled stillness in Luke Calder that spoke of a different kind of strength, something tempered and unyielding. The air crackled. From across the street, a woman with a weathered, kindly face and silver hair braided into a neat coronet watched them, her dark eyes missing nothing. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in Luke's direction. It was Senora Ruiz, the town midwife, a woman whose quiet authority seemed to rival any man's. Finally, Boone let out a snort of disgust, releasing the farmer's collar with a final, contemptuous shove. "You'll get what's coming to you, Miller. And you, Calder, you best learn to mind your own business." He shot a venomous glare around the assembled crowd before stalking off toward the saloon. Luke Calder watched him go, his expression unreadable. He then turned to the shaken farmer, helping him to his feet. "You all right, Jed?" "I am, thanks to you, Luke," Miller stammered, dusting off his trousers. "He gets bolder every day." "Trouble's like a tumbleweed," Luke said, his voice dropping so low Abigail had to strain to hear. "The more wind it gets, the bigger it grows." He tipped his hat to Miller, and then his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met Abigail's. It was just for a second, a fleeting acknowledgement of a shared witness. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a deep, weary appraisal. Then he turned and walked away, his stride long and purposeful, disappearing into the blinding glare of the afternoon. Abigail let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her clean slate was already smudged with the town's conflicts. She had seen the lines drawn, the power of a man like Silas Macready wielded through a cudgel like Boone Riker, and the quiet resistance of a man like Luke Calder. She found a room at the boarding house run by a stern but fair widow who asked few questions. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Abigail sat on the edge of her narrow bed and once again read Mr. Finney's letter. The ledger is the only thing standing between Macready and his control of the whole valley. He had written, "He means to build a dam, a small one, to divert the river's main flow just before the summer drought, forcing everyone to sell to him for pennies. He thinks no one knows. But I saw the plans. I saw the ledger in his safe. He stole it from the Territorial Survey Office." The word sent a familiar chill down her spine. In Missouri, she had been a teacher. She had spoken out against a town councilman who was cheating families on land deeds. For her trouble, she had been branded a liar, a troublemaker, her reputation destroyed by a cleverly orchestrated smear campaign. She had lost her job, her fiancé, her home. The accusation had been a lie, but a lie told loud enough becomes its own kind of truth. Now, here she was again, holding another man's truth, a dangerous secret in a town where power flowed from the barrel of a gun and the stroke of a pen on a forged document. Later that night, sleep would not come. The thin walls of the boarding house did little to muffle the sounds of Larkspur, the distant, melancholy piano, a burst of rowdy laughter, the lonely howl of a coyote. She thought of Luke Calder's eyes, the quiet strength in his stance. He was a man who stood his ground. She wondered what losses had carved the deep lines around his mouth. It was close to midnight when the first shout came. "Fire at the warehouse." Abigail was on her feet in an instant, pulling on her dress over her chemise. Outside, the night sky was no longer black but a terrifying, flickering orange. People poured out of the houses and the saloon, their faces lit by the hungry glow. The railroad's supply warehouse, a large wooden structure down by the tracks, was engulfed in flames. She ran with the others, her heart pounding. The heat was a physical blow, pushing her back. A bucket brigade was already forming, a desperate, inadequate line of men and women passing sloshing pails from the town's main well. Abigail found a place in the line without hesitation, her hands raw and aching as she passed bucket after heavy bucket, her face streaked with soot, her lungs burning with smoke. She saw Luke Calder near the front, his face grim and set, working with a focused intensity that seemed to direct the efforts of those around him. She saw Deputy Tabor shouting orders that were mostly lost in the roar of the fire. She even saw Boone Riker, though he seemed to be doing more observing than helping, a strange look on his face in the firelight. It was a losing battle. The warehouse was too far gone, its dry timber frame consumed with astonishing speed. They could only work to keep the flames from spreading to the adjacent buildings. Finally, with a great groan of surrendering timbers, the roof collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks and embers soaring into the night sky. The fight was over. A grim, exhausted silence fell over the crowd as they watched the last of the structure burn down to a glowing, skeletal frame. As the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern mountains, people began to sift through the still smoldering debris, looking for anything salvageable. It was Deputy Tabor who found it. He let out a small cry, holding something up. He bent down, pulling an object from the blackened soil near where the warehouse door had been. It was a knife. A simple whittling knife with a handle of pale, fire-scorched wood. He held it up for the others to see. Carved into the handle, clear as day in the growing light, were two initials, A.D. A murmur went through the crowd. Eyes began to turn, scanning the tired, soot-stained faces. Abigail felt a cold dread wash over her, a feeling so horribly familiar it nearly buckled her knees. Her name was Abigail Doyle, the new woman in town, the stranger. Her gaze swept the crowd and landed on Boone Riker. For just an instant, she saw a flicker of triumphant malice in his eyes, the ghost of a smirk on his lips before it was wiped away. He had done this. He had planted it. Then her eyes found Luke Calder. He was looking directly at her, his face a mask of smoke and fatigue. He held her gaze, and in his stormy eyes, she could not see condemnation. She could not see belief. She saw only a question, a deep and unsettling uncertainty that was, in its own way, almost as frightening as an accusation. The sun was rising on her new life, her clean slate, and it was rising on a lie that had been crafted just for her. The past she had run from had not just followed her, it had arrived in Larkspur before she did. The whispers followed Abigail Doyle like a shadow in the days after the fire. In a town as small and isolated as Larkspur, suspicion was a currency traded more freely than coin. The knife with the carved initials A.D. was proof enough for many. She was the outsider, the woman with no known people, and that made her an easy target for blame. Deputy Tabor had questioned her, his youth and unease plain to see. He had looked at her hands, searching for burns or scrapes, and had found only the calluses of a woman unused to hard labor. He had no evidence to hold her, but the verdict had been passed in the court of public opinion, a silent, shunning judgment in the eyes of many she passed on the street. She ignored them, with a stubborn set to her jaw that she had inherited from her father, a man who believed hard work was a prayer. She purchased a wagon, a plow, 2 barrels, and enough provisions to last a month. She loaded them herself, refusing the half-hearted offers of help that were more about curiosity than kindness. She drove the wagon out of Larkspur, heading toward the quarter section of land that was now both her sanctuary and her battleground. Her homestead was a swatch of dusty grassland that sloped gently toward a meandering creek, a tributary of the Rio del Bravo. It was not much, a sea of grama grass and prickly pear under an endless sky. But the thin ribbon of water was everything. It was life. It was the reason Silas McCready wanted this land, and it was the reason she would not give it up. She spent the first week in a fever of toil, her body aching with the protest of unused muscles. She cleared a patch of ground for a garden, hauled rocks for a foundation, and slept under the wagon, a single pistol beside her. The vast, star-dusted silence of the desert a far more comforting companion than the whispers of town. It was on the morning of her 8th day that she saw a rider approaching. She straightened from her work digging a post hole, her hand instinctively going to the small axe at her belt. The rider was Luke Calder. He reined in his buckskin horse a respectful distance away, not dismounting. He simply sat in his saddle, his gaze taking in the small signs of her labor, the neat stack of foundation stones, the cleared garden plot, the line of stakes marking a future fence. "Ma'am," he said, his voice as dry as the air. "Mr. Calder," she replied, her tone cool and even. "Looks like you're planning on staying." It was not a question. "This is my land. The United States government says so." He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon before returning to her. "That fire, the knife, it was a neat piece of work." Abigail's heart gave a painful thump. It had nothing to do with me. "I know," he said, and the simple certainty in his 2 words was more comforting than 1,000 protestations of support. "Boone Riker is a clumsy bully, but Silas McCready is not." That was his brand of trouble. Quiet, sharp, and meant to cut you out of the herd before you even know you are bleeding. She had not expected this quiet validation from the silent man she had seen in town. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because that creek," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the water, "feeds my lower pasture downstream. McCready dams this up, and my cattle will be drinking dust by August. Your fight is on my doorstep." He finally swung down from his horse, his movements economical and fluid. "You will need a proper fence and a diversion ditch dug legal and proper, according to territorial water rights, something McCready cannot tear down on a whim." And so began their unlikely partnership. He arrived each morning at sunrise with a wagon of his own, loaded with cedar posts and tools. They worked under the relentless sun. The silence between them broken only by the thud of the post driver, the scrape of shovels, and their own clipped instructions. They were a study in contrasts. Abigail, the former teacher, insisted on measuring the distance between posts with a knotted rope, ensuring they were perfectly aligned. Luke worked by eye, his movements guided by an ingrained knowledge of the land, sinking posts where the ground was firmest, regardless of perfect symmetry. "It will look crooked," she argued one afternoon, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. "It will stand against the wind," he countered, not pausing in his work. "Straight lines are for maps. Mrs. Doyle. The land has its own ideas." She learned to respect his ideas, just as he began to respect her tenacity. He saw that her soft hands were quickly becoming hard, that she never complained about the heat or the back-breaking labor. She learned to read his silences, to understand the subtle shift in his expression that meant a storm was gathering in the distant mountains or that a line of fence was not quite right. He spoke little of himself, but she pieced together a story from the fragments he let drop. He had served as a scout for the Union Army, a fact that explained his keen eyes and his knowledge of survival. He had a wife, Sarah, who had died of a fever 3 years prior, a loss that had hollowed him out and left this quiet, watchful man in her place. One day, Abigail brought out a small can of red paint she had tucked away in her trunk. Methodically, she began to paint a single, bright red band around the top of each fence post along the boundary facing the main road. Luke stopped his work, watching her. "What is that for?" "It is a line," she said, dipping her brush, "so everyone knows where my property begins and my patience ends." He did not smile, but a new light entered his eyes, a glimmer of deep and resonant approval. He had seen her spirit, and it was as tough and unyielding as the cedar posts they were driving into the hard earth. Her presence did not go unnoticed by the other small ranchers. Jed Miller, the man Luke had defended in town, rode out with his 2 young sons, offering to help haul stone. His wife, Mary, brought Abigail a loaf of fresh bread and a jar of preserves. They were wary at first, the town's gossip having reached them. But Abigail's steady labor and the silent endorsement of Luke Calder spoke louder than whispers. Seeing the children, their faces smudged with dirt but their eyes bright with curiosity, gave Abigail an idea. She had been a teacher, and that part of her had not died in Missouri. She cleaned out the space beneath the shade of a large cottonwood tree by the creek, set up a slate on a makeshift easel, and offered to teach the ranchers' children to read and write for a few hours each day. At first, only the Miller boys came, then a few others. Soon she had a small, boisterous group of 7 children. She taught them their letters using charcoal on a flat stone and told them stories of history and geography that made their world seem larger than the dusty valley. Luke would sometimes stop his work on the ditch and watch from a distance, a strange, unreadable expression on his face as the sound of children's laughter echoed across the homestead for the first time. Senora Ruiz came one afternoon, ostensibly to check on Mary Miller's youngest, but she stayed for an hour, watching Abigail with her flock. As she left, she pressed a small bundle of dried herbs into Abigail's hand. "For strength," the old woman had said, her eyes warm with a wisdom that seemed as ancient as the land itself. "You are planting more than seeds here, Hija. You are planting roots." The community she was building was a fragile thing. However, the rumors from town grew more persistent. A surveyor had been seen with Silas McCready plotting a new route for a railroad spur line, a route that would bypass Larkspur, effectively killing the town. Unless McCready could offer the railroad something it needed: guaranteed water. The whispers of a dam, once a vague threat in Mr. Finney's letter, now felt like an imminent reality. The warning came on a moonless night, a piece of paper weighted by a rock left on her doorstep. The words were crude, written in charcoal: "Get out or be carried out." She burned the note in her small cooking fire, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a cold, hard anger. She mentioned it to Luke the next morning. He examined the ground around her small, unfinished cabin, his eyes missing nothing. He said little, but his silence was heavier than usual, and he spent the rest of the day working with a grim, focused energy. The attack came 2 nights later. Abigail was jolted from a light sleep by a sharp crack that was not thunder. It was immediately followed by the sound of splintering wood and the gush of water. She grabbed her pistol and scrambled out from under the wagon. In the faint starlight, she could see a dark spray in the air. One of her 2 precious water barrels had been shot through. Before she could even think, another shot rang out, whining past her head so close she felt the air move. She dropped to the ground, her heart hammering against the hard earth. She was pinned down, exposed. The shots were coming from a rocky outcrop about 100 yards away. She lay still, trying to control her breathing, the smell of dust and cordite sharp in her nostrils. She was alone. The nearest homestead was miles away. The shooter could take his time. Then, from her left, she heard the soft thud of horses' hooves on the dry grass. It was not the frantic gallop of an escape, but a quiet, deliberate approach. A low voice cut through the night. "Drop the rifle and walk away." It was Luke. A 3rd shot answered him, the muzzle flash a brief, angry flower in the darkness. She heard a grunt of pain, followed by the sound of Luke's horse shying away. Panic seized her. He was hurt. But then came another sound, the unmistakable double click of a Winchester rifle being cocked. "That was your last chance," Luke's voice called out. "Harder now, colder. The next one will not miss." There was a long, tense silence. Abigail could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. Then came the sound of scrambling rocks and the fast retreat of a horse fading into the darkness. She waited, every muscle tensed, until she was sure the danger was gone. Luke's voice came again, closer this time. "Mrs. Doyle, are you all right?" "Yes," she managed, her voice shaky. I heard. Are you hurt?" He walked into the faint starlight, leading his horse. He was holding his left arm, and she could see a dark stain spreading on his shirt sleeve. "It is just a graze. The bullet tore through the muscle. It will be fine." She rushed to his side, tearing a strip from her petticoat. "Let me see!" He allowed her to tend to the wound, hissing in a sharp breath as she cleaned it with water from the remaining barrel and bound it tightly. The bullet had gouged a deep, bloody furrow along his forearm, a few inches higher, and it would have shattered the bone. A few inches to the right, and it would have found his heart. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He would have killed me." "He was not trying to kill you," Luke said, his voice strained with pain. "Not yet. He was sending a message. Ruin your water, scare you off. Killing a woman brings too much attention." He walked over to the ruined barrel. The moonlight shone through the jagged hole in the wood. He knelt, probing the damp earth on the other side with his fingers. After a moment, he grunted and stood up, holding a small, misshapen piece of lead in his palm. "Just as I thought," he murmured, rolling the heavy slug in his fingers. "A Sharps, 45 caliber, big medicine for shooting a water barrel." He looked at her, his eyes dark and serious in the moonlight. "There are not many men around here who use a rifle like this, but I know for a fact that Boone Riker bought a box of this exact ammunition at the Mercantile last week, said he was going buffalo hunting." Luke's mouth tightened into a grim line. Looks like he found a different kind of prey. The heavy lead slug felt potent in Abigail's palm, a small piece of metal that carried the weight of a death threat. In the clear light of morning, Luke's arm, cleaned and tightly bandaged, was a stark reminder of how close that threat had come. They stood by the splintered barrel, the evidence between them damning and, frustratingly, useless. Boone Riker's word against theirs would mean nothing, especially with Deputy Tabor caught between the law and the powerful grip of Silas McCready. "A bullet proves a gun was fired," Luke said, his voice flat. "It does not prove who was holding it." "No," Abigail agreed, her mind racing. "But it confirms they are not just trying to scare me. They are willing to escalate. We need more than suspicion. We need proof of the larger crime." She thought of the letter, the last words of a man who had tried to do the right thing. She hurried to her wagon and retrieved the satchel, pulling out the worn pages from Mr. Finney. She had read his words a dozen times, but now she looked at the paper itself. It was a cheap stationery, but he had written his final, urgent message on the back of something else. She carefully unfolded the letter. The reverse side held a section of a hand-drawn map. It was not a land survey, but a rough sketch of a town layout. Most of it was blank, but a few buildings were drawn with more care: the depot, the Mercantile, and a large two-story building on the main street marked with a star. Beneath it, a single word: silver. "The Silver Star Saloon," Luke said, looking over her shoulder. His breath was warm on her neck. Finney was a quiet man, not the saloon type. Perhaps he was not there for the whiskey. Abigail murmured, her finger tracing the drawing. "The letter. He said he saw the ledger in McCready's safe. Where would a man like McCready keep his office?" "Above the Silver Star," Luke answered, his voice grim. "He owns the building, rents the bottom floor to the saloon, keeps the top for his business." The path was clear. If fraught with danger, they needed to go to town, not to confront, but to listen, to find a crack in the wall of silence and fear that McCready had built around his dealings. Before they went to the saloon, however, there was one stop they had to make. Justice, however frail, deserved its chance. They found Deputy Tabor in his small, stuffy office, a room that smelled of stale coffee and paperwork. He looked up as they entered, and a flicker of anxiety crossed his young face. Luke placed the deformed bullet on the corner of his desk. "This was fired at Mrs. Doyle 2 nights ago," Luke stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "It grazed my arm, Sharps 45 caliber. Boone Riker bought the only box of that ammunition sold in Larkspur last week." Tabor stared at the slug as if it were a coiled snake. He picked it up, felt its weight, and set it down again. He ran a hand through his already messy hair. "Luke, you know I cannot do anything with this. It is your word against his. Riker will say he was miles away, and half a dozen of his cronies will swear to it." "So you are going to do nothing?" Abigail asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "A woman is shot at on her own land, and the law is just going to look the other way." "I am not looking the other way," the deputy retorted, his frustration boiling over. "But I need evidence that will stand up. County Manager Henderson has made it very clear that Mr. McCready is a respected businessman, a pillar of this community. He said I am not to harass his employees without a formal complaint backed by unimpeachable proof. Those were his exact words, unimpeachable proof." "So your hands are tied," Luke said. It was not a question. "Tighter than a hog at slaughtering time," Tabor admitted, his gaze falling to his desk. "I am sorry. I truly am. Be careful, both of you." They left the office, the hot sun and dusty street feeling even more hostile than before. The law was a house with no doors for people like them. They were on their own, The Silver Star Saloon was louder and dimmer than Abigail had expected. Even in the middle of the afternoon, it was a hive of low voices, clinking glasses, and the ever-present, slightly off-key piano. The air was thick with the smells of sweat, spilled liquor, and tobacco smoke. Men at the bar turned to watch them as they entered, their gazes lingering on Abigail with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Luke's presence beside her acted as a shield, his reputation as a man not to be trifled with preceding him. He guided her to a small, secluded table in a corner, his hand resting briefly on the small of her back, a gesture of reassurance that felt both foreign and welcome. They ordered sarsaparilla, their purpose not to drink, but to watch, to listen. On a small, raised platform at the far end of the room, a woman was singing. She was a handsome woman with skin the color of rich coffee and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, knowing sadness. Her voice was a marvel, a low, smoky alto that filled the room not with boisterous energy, but with a profound sense of soul that commanded a respectful silence from the rough men in the audience. The song was a spiritual, a lament for a lost home and a prayer for a promised land. When she finished, the applause was genuine and sustained. "That's Zadie Bell," Luke said quietly. "She has been here about a year, keeps to herself, mostly." They waited. They watched as Silas McCready came down the interior stairs from his office, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He exchanged a few words with Boone Riker at the bar, clapping the big man on the shoulder, before leaving through the front doors. They watched the flow of commerce and conspiracy, the subtle exchanges of cash and information, the whole corrupt ecosystem of the town on display. When Zadie Bell finished her set and stepped down from the stage, Abigail knew it was time. She crossed the room, Luke a few steps behind her, a silent, watchful guardian. "Miss Bell," Abigail said, her voice low, "may we have a word with you? It is a matter of great importance." Zadie looked from Abigail's earnest face to Luke's guarded one. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes assessing them with a startling intelligence. "In the alley," she said, her voice even softer than her singing. "Give me 5 minutes." The alley behind the saloon was a narrow, shadowed space cluttered with barrels and crates. Zadie Bell appeared moments later, wiping her hands on an apron. "This is not a safe place for conversations," she said, her tone wary. "We believe you may be in a position to prevent a great injustice," Abigail began, deciding that directness was the only path. "We know about the survey ledger, the one Silas McCready stole." Zadie's composure cracked for a fraction of a second. A flicker of fear, or perhaps surprise, crossed her features before being replaced by a careful neutrality. "I do not know what you are talking about." "Please?" Abigail pressed, her voice urgent. "A good man, an engineer named Alistair Finney. He lost his life because of that ledger. He wrote to me before he died. He was trying to protect the settlers along the river." At the mention of Finney's name, Zadie's expression softened. A genuine sorrow touched her eyes. "Alistair," she whispered. "He was a gentleman. He treated me with respect, not like—" She trailed off, glancing toward the saloon. "Did you see it, Miss Bell?" Luke asked, his voice gentle but firm. "The ledger." Zadie hesitated, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I saw it. I clean Mr. McCready's office sometimes. He is a man of habits. He takes the book out of his safe every Tuesday evening. A big, heavy book full of maps and numbers. I saw him, through the crack in the door. I heard him talking with Boone Riker. He called it his ace in the hole. He talked about a dam, a small dam. He said, just enough to choke the creek before the summer heat, enough to make everyone thirsty. It was a confirmation of their worst fears. "Is the ledger still there in the safe?" Abigail asked. "As far as I know," Zadie replied. "It is a heavy iron thing, not something a man can carry around." She looked from Abigail to Luke, her gaze lingering on the fresh bandage on his arm. "You are going against him. You know what he is capable of." "We know," Luke said, "but we do not have a choice." Zadie seemed to wrestle with an internal conflict. She looked down at her hands, then back up at them, a new resolve in her eyes. "Alistair, before he left on his last trip, He gave me something, for safekeeping. He told me it was the key to a music box he was having repaired for his sister. She reached into a small pocket hidden in the seams of her dress and pulled out a small, ornate brass key. But Alistair Finney did not have a sister, and this does not look like any music box key I have ever seen. She pressed the cold metal into Abigail's hand. It was a safe key, a duplicate, a piece of foresight from a dead man that might be their only hope. A noise at the end of the alley made them all freeze. Boone Riker stood there, flanked by two of his hard-faced companions. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he sneered. "Looks like a little prayer meeting. Calder, the new schoolmarm, and the singer. That is a mighty interesting collection of folks. MacReady does not like people whispering in alleys. Makes him nervous." Luke pushed Abigail gently behind him, his body shifting into a relaxed, ready stance. "We are just leaving, Boone." "I do not think so," Riker said, taking a step forward, his men fanning out to block any escape. "I think you will stay. We need to have a little talk about minding your own business." The wind, which had been a restless whisper all afternoon, suddenly began to howl. It whipped down the alley, kicking up dust and trash, rattling the loose shutters on the back of the saloon. The sky, once a brilliant blue, was turning a sickly yellow-brown. A sandstorm. "Looks like the weather's turning. Boone," Luke said, his voice dangerously calm, his eyes never leaving Riker's. "You should get inside." Riker laughed. "I am not afraid of a little dust." The first wave of the storm hit them then, a solid wall of wind and sand that stung their eyes and stole their breath. Visibility dropped to near zero in an instant. The world became a roaring, blinding chaos. In the confusion, a figure emerged from the swirling dust beside them, silent as a ghost. He was a wiry man with long, braided hair and the sharp, hawk-like features of a Mescalero Apache. He held a long knife in one hand and moved with a fluid grace that seemed part of the storm itself. "Nayland," Luke said, his voice full of relief. The Apache man said nothing. He simply pointed his knife toward the far end of the alley, away from the street. Through the maelstrom, he had found them a path. Boone and his men were disoriented, cursing and shielding their faces against the stinging sand. "Go!" Luke yelled over the roar of the wind. Grabbing Abigail's arm, Zadie was right beside them. Nayland led the way, navigating the blinding storm as if he could see the unseen currents in the air. They scrambled over crates, ran blindly through the swirling brown fog, their lungs burning, their eyes streaming. Behind them, they could hear Riker shouting in fury, his voice swallowed by the storm. Nayland led them to the shelter of a livery stable, the big doors groaning against the force of the gale. Inside, among the warm, calming scents of horses and hay, they collapsed, gasping for air, their faces and clothes caked with dust. They were safe. For now. The storm raged outside, a temporary shield against their enemies. Abigail looked down at her hand. She was still clutching the small brass key, a cold, hard promise of the truth, now more dangerous and more necessary than ever. The sandstorm passed as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world scoured and strangely silent. The wind died, and the air, thick and brown for hours, slowly cleared, revealing a sky of bruised lavender and a sun that was a watery, pale disk. Every surface was coated in a fine layer of dust, softening the harsh lines of the landscape into a smooth, monochrome tableau. Nayland, their silent guide, had led them from the livery stable through the hushed, deserted outskirts of town to a sheltered bend in the Rio del Bravo, a place protected by a high bluff and a thicket of cottonwood trees whose leaves were heavy with dust. He had ensured they had water and a place to make a fire, shared a piece of jerky with Luke in a silent communion of men who understood the wilderness, and then, with a nod, had vanished back into the landscape as if he were an inseparable part of it. Zadie Bell, exhausted but resolute, had been given the driest spot to rest, wrapped in a spare blanket. She slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had stared into the face of ruin and had chosen to fight back. A quiet understanding passed between the three of them. Zadie was their witness, their charge. and they would protect her. But the storm had left its mark on Abigail. She felt as if the grit had worked its way not just into her clothes and hair, but into her very soul. She was tired of being hunted, of being dirty, of the constant, grinding fear. She looked at the river, its water running murky and brown with the runoff from the storm, yet it was moving, it was life, it was cleansing. While Luke checked on the horses and began to build a small, smokeless fire, Abigail took a piece of soap from her satchel and a clean towel and walked downstream, around a small bend that offered a curtain of willow trees. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, painting the western sky in strokes of gold and rose. The air grew cooler. She stripped off her dusty, sweat-stiffened clothes and waded into the river. The water was shockingly cold, a jolt that drove the air from her lungs and raised goosebumps on her skin. But as she submerged herself, the chill gave way to a profound sense of release. She scrubbed at her skin, washing away the layers of dust and grime, feeling as though she were also washing away the whispers of larkspur, the sneer on Boone Riker's face, the suffocating memory of the alley. She was not the accused arsonist, not the frightened woman pinned down by gunfire. Here, in the river, she was just a woman, alive and breathing under a vast, beautiful sky. She leaned back, letting her hair float out around her, the current a gentle tug against her body. The water lapped at her ears, muffling the sounds of the world, leaving only the beat of her own heart. A sense of peace, fragile but real, settled over her. Luke had not meant to find her. He had walked along the riverbank to check a line of rabbit snares Nayland had suggested, his mind preoccupied with their next move. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to the quiet calculation of survival, the responsibility for Abigail, and now for Zadie, weighed on him. He rounded the bend of willows and stopped dead. She was there, in the middle of the river, her skin gleaming like pale marble in the soft, golden light of the setting sun, her dark hair fanned out on the water's surface like a silken net. For a moment, his mind went utterly blank. He saw not just a woman, but a vision of impossible grace and serenity in the heart of this harsh, unforgiving land. His first instinct was to retreat, to grant her the privacy he had unintentionally stolen. His second, a deeper, more painful one, was a memory of another woman, another river, a lifetime ago, Sarah. A pang of loss, so sharp and sudden it was like a physical blow, struck him. He must have made a sound, a scuff of his boot on the gravelly bank, because she turned her head. Her eyes widened, and he saw a flicker of vulnerability, a startled intake of breath. He saw the faint, silvery line of a scar high on her shoulder, a mark he had never noticed before. He braced himself for a cry of alarm, for anger, for shame. Instead, a slow, audacious smile spread across her face. It was a smile that took her own trembling fear and defiance and wove them into a challenge. She tilted her head back, the water sluicing through her hair, and her laughter, clear and rich, echoed in the quiet evening air. She shouted, her voice carrying across the water, full of a wit he was only just beginning to comprehend. "You gonna join me or just watch?" The words struck him with more force than the sandstorm. Heat flooded his face, a dark, embarrassed flush that rose from his collar to the roots of his hair, for the first time since she had met him. Abigail saw Luke Calder completely flustered. He spun around so fast he nearly lost his footing, turning his back to her as if she were the midday sun. "Ma'am," he stammered, his voice rough. "Mrs. Doyle, I am sorry, I did not mean... I was just checking the snares. I will go." He started to stride away, his back ramrod straight. But then he stopped. He looked at the rough blanket he had slung over his shoulder against the evening chill. He turned back, his eyes fixed firmly on the distant mountains, and walked to the river's edge. He laid the blanket on a clean, dry stone. Then he walked away, disappearing around the bend without another word. When Abigail emerged from the water, her skin tingling and clean, the thick wool blanket was waiting for her. She wrapped herself in its warmth, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was an act of quiet care, of respect, a gesture more intimate than any heated glance. She found him by the fire, staring into the flames, his profile etched by the flickering light. He had his hat off, and his hair was ruffled by the breeze. He looked younger, and somehow more solitary than ever. She sat on a log across from him, tucking the blanket around her feet. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the blanket." He nodded, not looking at her. "I am sorry for my intrusion." "There is no need to apologize," she said. "I am the one who shouted at you." She hesitated, then added, "It was either that or scream. I find shouting is more productive." A small, wry smile touched his lips, a rare and fleeting thing. It would seem so. The silence that fell between them was different now. It was not the comfortable quiet of shared work, but a more fragile, charged stillness. "I saw the scar on your shoulder," he said, his voice low, still looking at the fire. "It looks old." Abigail's hand went to her shoulder, a reflexive gesture. "It is. From my past life, a reminder that speaking the truth to powerful men can be a dangerous business." She took a breath, the firelight warming her face. "I was engaged to be married once, back in Missouri, to the son of the town's most important citizen. I was a teacher. I discovered his father was cheating settlers, men and women who had saved for years, on their land deeds, changing boundaries and forging signatures. I thought the truth mattered. I thought my fiancé would stand with me." She laughed, a small bitter sound. "He did not. His father made sure I lost my job. He spread rumors. The engagement was broken. The scar is from the night my schoolhouse was burned down, a falling beam." Luke finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw not pity but a deep, somber understanding. "Some fires are not meant to be put out," he said quietly. "Sarah, my wife, she died of a fever. Came on fast. The doctor could not do anything. 1 week she was hanging laundry and singing to herself. The next, she was gone." He looked down at his own hands, large and capable, and yet they had been helpless. "For a long time, I thought if I just kept to myself, kept my world small, I could not lose anything else. I built a fence around my heart just as high as the ones around my land." He looked up at her, and the carefully constructed walls he had lived behind for 3 years seemed to crumble, leaving him exposed in the firelight. "Being around you, it is not easy, Abigail. You do not just build fences, you paint them bright red. You make a man think about things he had long since buried." Her name on his lips, spoken with such quiet gravity, was a revelation. He saw her, not as the mysterious Mrs. Doyle, but as Abigail, the fear she had always felt. The fear that happiness was a fleeting, fragile thing, that to reach for it was to invite heartbreak, warred with a new, burgeoning hope. She could see the same battle reflected in his eyes. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand on his forearm, over the bandage that covered his wound. His skin was warm. He did not pull away. "Maybe some things are worth the risk of losing," she whispered. He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face, his gaze searching her eyes. He leaned forward, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She met him halfway. His kiss was not what she would have expected. There was no desperate passion, no fire of long-suppressed desire. It was gentle, hesitant, as tentative as a first spring rain on dry ground. It was a question, a confirmation, a quiet promise. It tasted of wood smoke and sorrow and a profound, shared loneliness. When he drew back, they simply looked at each other, the fire crackling between them, the sound of the river a soft murmur in the background. The world was still dangerous. Their enemies were still waiting, but in that moment, they were not alone. They sat in silence for a long time, the warmth of the fire pushing back the night's chill. Luke's mind, always working, always looking for an angle, suddenly made a connection. "The dam," he said, his voice a low rumble. "McCready has been bringing in supplies for months, not by the railroad, where everyone would see. He has them brought in by wagon train, from the south. Crates of tools, blasting powder, equipment." "How do you know?" Abigail asked, stirring from the reverie of their shared moment. "I saw one of the wagons lose a wheel a while back, near my property line," he said. "The driver was one of Riker's men. They had to unload some of the crates to fix the axle. Every single crate was marked, not with paint or a stencil. It was a brand, burned into the wood, McCready's brand. It is an iron seal, a big M with a C inside it, circled by a railroad track." He looked at her, his eyes sharp with a new thought. "An iron seal. That is a legal mark. It proves ownership. If we could find one of those crates at the dam site, that would be the kind of proof Deputy Tabor cannot ignore. It would tie McCready directly to the whole operation." The plan was born of desperation and moonlight. The planting season was on the cusp, and the creek that fed the small homesteads had dwindled to a pathetic trickle. Jed Miller's corn was wilting, and other families faced the same slow, thirsty ruin. Waiting for the law to act was waiting for the crops to die. They had the key. They had the knowledge. They had to act. Under the cover of a moonless, star-pricked sky, the four of them rode not as a posse, but as shadows. Luke led them on a winding, circuitous route through the Badlands, a path only a man who had read the land like a book would know. Nolan scouted ahead, a deeper shadow among the rest, his presence more a feeling than a sight. Abigail rode beside Luke, her heart a steady, determined drum against her ribs. Behind them, Zadie Bell. Her singer's finery exchanged for a borrowed pair of denim trousers and a dark shirt, rode with a quiet resolve that Abigail deeply admired. They left the horses tethered in a narrow arroyo a mile away and proceeded on foot. The dam was not a grand structure, but a crude, effective barrier of felled trees, rock, and packed earth, built across a choke point in the canyon where the creek ran deep and fast. It was an ugly scar on the land, a monument to one man's greed. A single lantern cast a weak yellow circle of light near a small shack, where two of Boone Riker's men kept a lazy watch. Nolan moved with an unnerving silence, melting into the rocks and scrub. He returned minutes later and conveyed with a series of spare, precise hand gestures that one man was asleep, the other more interested in a bottle than his duties. It was the opening they needed. They moved like wolves, Luke in the lead, down the steep canyon side. The air grew cool and damp near the dam, and the silence was unnerving, broken only by the faint, frustrated whisper of the water seeping through the packed earth. The main flow was controlled by a large iron sluice gate, its release mechanism a heavy, rust-pitted wheel that required a great deal of force to turn. While Nolan kept watch, his knife a dull gleam in the starlight, Luke put his shoulder to the wheel. He strained, the muscles in his back and arms cording, his boots slipping on the damp ground. It would not budge. "It is rusted tight," he grunted, his voice a low whisper. "I need leverage." Abigail looked around, her mind racing. Her eyes fell on the long steel axle of a broken wagon wheel abandoned near the construction site. "Luke," she whispered, pointing. Together, they wedged the heavy axle between the spokes of the wheel. Abigail and Zadie added their weight alongside Luke's. "Now," Luke commanded. They pushed, all their strength and desperation focused on that single point. For a moment, nothing happened. Then with a deep, groaning screech of tortured metal, the wheel began to turn. It was agonizingly slow, each inch a victory. As the gate lifted, the whisper of the creek grew to a gurgle, then a roar. A torrent of dark, liberated water surged through the opening, a living thing released from its cage. It was the sound of hope. It was also the sound of their discovery. A shout came from the guard shack. The lantern light bobbed wildly as the two men, now fully awake and alarmed, ran toward the dam. "Go," Luke yelled, pulling the axle free. "Back to the horses." They scrambled back up the canyon wall, loose rocks skittering under their feet. A shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the rock face with a high-pitched whine. Zadie stumbled, and Abigail grabbed her arm, pulling her along. They were exposed, running through the pale starlight. Easy targets. They reached the top of the canyon and plunged into the maze of ravines and washes that characterized the Badlands. Behind them, They could hear the angry shouts of their pursuers, now joined by others. Boone Riker's voice, a furious bellow, echoed in the night. He had been nearby, waiting. The chase was a nightmare of stumbling flight through a landscape designed to trap the unwary. Nayland led them unerringly, his knowledge of the terrain their only advantage. But Riker's men were on horseback, and they were gaining. The air began to feel heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. A low, distant rumble, too deep and sustained for gunfire, seemed to vibrate through the soles of their boots. Nayland stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. He tilted his head, listening not with his ears but with his entire body. He pointed toward the high ground, his expression urgent. "Water," he said, the single word sharp with warning. "It comes." A sudden, cool wind snaked through the canyon, carrying the scent of rain and wet earth. They had not seen a cloud in the sky, but miles upstream, in the high mountains. A summer squall had unleashed its fury. Before they could react, they heard it, a low roar that grew with terrifying speed into the sound of a freight train. It was not just water, it was a liquid battering ram of mud, rocks and uprooted trees, pouring down the very canyon they were using as an escape route. They scrambled for higher ground, clawing their way up a steep, shale-covered slope. Below them, they saw a wagon, caught in a low-lying camp. It was Jed Miller's. He had been grazing some of his cattle in the lower valley. They saw him shouting, trying to free his panicked horses as his oldest son, a boy of about 10, struggled to climb onto a large boulder. The flash flood hit the camp with explosive force. The wagon was tossed aside like a child's toy. Jed Miller was swept away, vanishing into the churning brown chaos. His son screamed, clinging desperately to the boulder as the water surged around him, rising higher with every second. Luke did not hesitate. He slid down the slope, finding a precarious handhold on a tough, gnarled juniper root. He reached out his hand to the boy. "Jump," he roared over the din. "I will catch you." The boy, terror-stricken, looked from the raging water to Luke's outstretched hand. He leaped. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked as if he would fall short. But Luke's arm shot out, his fingers closing around the boy's wrist like a band of steel. With a great heave, Luke pulled the boy up onto the ledge beside him. But the surge of water caused by the boulder and the struggling horses created a powerful undertow. The section of bank where Abigail was standing, already loosened by the flood, gave way. With a cry of surprise, she slid down the muddy bank and into the maelstrom. The cold was a stunning, violent shock. The current seized her, pulling her under, tumbling her over and over in a world of suffocating brown. She fought her way to the surface, gasping for air, only to be slammed by a floating log. Her head struck the wood with a sickening thud, and the world dissolved into a swirl of blackness and roaring water. Luke saw her go under. He saw the log strike her. He did not think. He shoved the boy into Nolan's waiting arms and launched himself into the flood. He was a strong swimmer, but this was not water. It was a grinding, moving wall of debris. He fought the current, his powerful strokes barely enough to keep him from being dragged under. He saw her, a pale form being swept downstream. He reached her just as her head was about to slip beneath the surface again. He wrapped one arm around her chest, holding her head above the water, and used his other arm and his legs to fight the current, trying to angle them toward the canyon wall. A length of rope, torn from Jed Miller's wagon, snaked past him. He grabbed it, its rough fibers biting into his palm. It was anchored to something, snagged on a massive rock outcropping. With the last of his strength, he pulled them, hand over hand, out of the main current and into the relative calm of the eddy behind the rock. He collapsed onto a narrow ledge, hauling Abigail's limp body out of the water, his lungs burning, his body a mass of bruises. On the canyon rim above, the chaos gave Boone Riker his opportunity. His pursuit of Luke and Abigail was thwarted by the flood, but he saw Zadie and Nayland exposed as they helped the Miller boy to safety. Nayland, seeing the danger, shoved the boy toward a crevice and turned to face Riker, his knife in his hand. But Riker was not interested in a fair fight. He raised his pistol. "The singer," he barked at his men. "Grab the singer." Before Nayland could intervene, two of Riker's men were on Zadie, grabbing her arms. She fought, Her voice raised in a cry of fury, not fear. Nayland lunged, but Riker fired his pistol into the air. One more step. Apache, Riker snarled. And she dies right here. You are lucky I do not kill you both. Nayland froze, his face a mask of cold fury. He was one man against three with guns. He could not save her. He could only watch as they dragged a struggling Zadie Bell away, her eyes locking with his in a silent, desperate appeal before she disappeared into the gloom. Down below, as the floodwaters began to slowly recede, Abigail coughed, water sputtering from her lips. She shivered violently, her eyes fluttering open. She was alive. Luke held her, shielding her from the wind, his own body trembling with cold and exhaustion. The flood had remade the canyon floor, scouring it clean in some places, piling up debris in others. As the water level dropped, a dark, heavy object was revealed, wedged between two boulders where it had been torn from the earth. It was an iron strongbox, the kind used for valuables. The force of the water had sprung the lock. Its heavy lid lay a few feet away. Luke, his arm still around Abigail, stared at it. Pushed out from the broken box, half buried in the mud and silt, was a large, leather-bound book. It had been wrapped in a thick, oiled canvas, which had protected it from the worst of the water. On its cover, in faded gold leaf, were the words New Mexico Territorial Survey, District 7. The river, in its fury, had punished the men who tried to hoard its water, and in its aftermath, it had delivered to them the very truth they were willing to die for. They returned to Larkspur not in triumph, but as ghosts. Just before the false dawn, the town was a tinderbox of rumor and fear. Jed Miller had been found downstream, broken but alive, saved by the same juniper root that had offered Luke a handhold. His story of the flood, of his son's rescue, and of Abigail and Luke's presence at the illegal dam had spread like wildfire. Opposing this was a new, official-looking notice, nailed to the door of the Mercantile and the post office. It was a wanted poster, authorized by the county manager, offering a reward for the arrest of Abigail Doyle on charges of arson and grand larceny. Silas McCready had played his hand. Their first stop was not the deputy's office, but the small, quiet home of Senora Ruiz. It was a sanctuary of calm in the tense town, while Abigail tended to Luke's fresh collection of cuts and bruises. Nayland slipped back into the night. He had one task to find Zadie. He moved without a sound, a phantom propelled by a cold, controlled rage. He knew where Boone Riker would feel safest, where he would take his prize to await instructions from his master, the rooms above the Silver Star Saloon. Luke held the heavy, mud-stained ledger in his hands. It was the truth, solid and real. "It is not enough," he said, his voice a low rasp. "McCready will claim we planted it, without Zadie to testify about seeing it in his safe, and without that key she holds. It is just a book we found in the mud." Everything hinged on Nalin. The minutes stretched into an hour. The sky to the east began to lighten from black to a deep indigo, just as the first birds began to stir. Nalin reappeared at the back door. He was not alone. Zadie was with him, pale and exhausted, but unharmed. There was a fresh, angry-looking bruise on her cheek. "He had her locked in a storage room," Nalin said, his voice tight. "2 guards. They are sleeping now." He did not elaborate on how he had encouraged their slumber, and no one asked. Zadie looked at Abigail and Luke, and the fear in her eyes was overlaid with a fierce determination. She reached into her dress and produced the small, ornate brass key. "He did not find this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Let us go finish this." They walked together to the deputy's office, a small, determined procession in the gray morning light. They found Deputy Tabor sitting at his desk, his face haggard. He had not slept. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening at the sight of the ledger Luke placed squarely in the middle of his desk. "The Territorial Survey ledger," Abigail said quietly, "washed out of a strongbox from McCready's camp by the flood." Luke placed the misshapen .45 caliber slug beside it, Boone Riker's bullet. Zadie stepped forward and placed the small brass key next to the slug. The key to McCready's safe given to me by Alistair Finney before he died. I saw that ledger inside that safe with my own eyes." Nolan added a small, splintered piece of wood to the collection. On it was a clear, burned-in brand, a large M with a C inside it, circled by a railroad track. From a crate at the dam, it matches the brand on McCready's cattle and his wagons. It was a mountain of evidence, tangible and irrefutable. Deputy Tabor stared at it, then up at their faces. For a long moment, he was silent. The pressure from the county manager, the weight of McCready's power, the fear for his own position, all warred on his young face. Then, he stood up. The boyish hesitation was gone, replaced by the hardened resolve of a man who had finally chosen his side. "The justice of the peace makes his circuit this morning," Tabor said, his voice firm. "His court is the town hall. Be there when the doors open. I'm going to serve a subpoena to Mr. Silas McCready and Mr. Boone Riker. This ends today." Word spread through Larkspur with the speed of gossip. The wanted woman was in the deputy's office. The justice was in town. There was going to be a hearing. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern mountains, the town hall was packed. It was not a proper courtroom, just a large, open room with a raised platform at one end and rows of benches. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and nervous anticipation. The townsfolk were divided, a human representation of the valley's water war. Jed Miller and the other small homesteaders stood in a grim cluster on one side. McCready's ranch hands and business associates, looking smug and confident, filled the other. McCready arrived with his lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man from Santa Fe. McCready himself was the picture of offended dignity, his face set in a mask of polite concern, as if he were attending a tedious but necessary civic function. Boone Riker slumped in a chair behind him, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud of resentment. The justice of the peace, a weary-looking man with a magnificent white mustache, called the room to order. He read the charges from the wanted poster, arson and theft, against Abigail Doyle. He asked her how she pleaded. Abigail stood, her voice clear and steady, filling the silent room. "I plead not guilty, and I bring a counter-complaint against Mr. Silas McCready and Mr. Boone Riker for conspiracy, attempted murder, illegal damming of a public waterway, and the deliberate framing of an innocent citizen." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. McCready's lawyer leaped to his feet, objecting, but the justice waved him to silence. His interest clearly piqued. "Those are serious accusations, madam. You had best have serious proof." "I do," Abigail said, and with a calm, methodical precision that came from years of teaching, she laid out the facts. She spoke of the knife, planted at the fire. She presented the ledger, explaining what it was and how it proved the water rights belonged to the people. She spoke not with passion, but with the unassailable logic of the truth. Luke was called next. He testified about the attack on the homestead, presenting the bullet. He told the court what Nayland had found, showing the piece of branded wood and explaining its significance, tying McCready's property directly to the illegal dam. Then Zadie Bell took the stand. All eyes were on her. She walked with her head held high, the bruise on her cheek a stark badge of honor. She told the court about Alistair Finney. She told them about seeing the ledger in the safe. She recounted the conversation she had overheard between McCready and Riker about their plan to choke the valley of its water. And finally, she held up the small brass key. "Mr. Finney gave me this," she said, her voice ringing with the same soulful power she brought to her songs. "He trusted me, and I trust this court to see the truth." She placed the key on the justice's desk. The weight of the evidence was crushing. The mood in the room had shifted. The smug confidence on the faces of McCready's men had been replaced by nervous uncertainty. McCready himself had gone pale, his mask of civility beginning to crack. The final piece came from an unexpected source. Nayland, who had stood silently at the back of the room, stepped forward. He did not speak. He simply unrolled a large, detailed sketch he had made on a piece of tanned hide. It was a map of the dam, showing the location of the branded crates, the shoddy construction, the shod footprints of Boone Riker that he had found in the mud. It was a silent, powerful testimony from a man who read the earth. The justice of the peace stared at the evidence before him, He looked at MacCready. "Mr. MacCready, do you have a response to this?" MacCready's lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but for the first time, Silas MacCready's composure shattered. He saw his empire of lies crumbling before the combined courage of a schoolteacher, a quiet rancher, a saloon singer, and an Apache scout. But Boone Riker was not a man of words or legal maneuvering. He was an animal, and he was cornered. As the justice opened his mouth to speak, Riker exploded from his chair. He overturned the table, a roar of pure rage erupting from his throat, and his hand clawed for the pistol at his hip. "No more talk," he bellowed. The room erupted in panic. People screamed and dove for cover. Deputy Tabor, who had been standing near the platform, reacted instantly. He drew his own weapon and stepped forward, placing himself between Riker and the witnesses. "Drop it, Riker, it is over." Riker fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. A red stain blossomed on Tabor's shoulder, and he staggered back, a look of shocked pain on his face. Luke moved with a speed that was terrifying in its efficiency. He did not lunge at Riker. He kicked a fallen bench into Riker's path, sending the big man stumbling. In that split second of imbalance, Luke was on him. He did not draw his own gun. He grabbed Riker's wrist, twisting it with brutal force. A bone snapped with a sickening crack, and Riker screamed, the pistol clattering to the floor. Luke slammed Riker's face into the wall, then threw him to the floor, pinning him with a knee to the chest. He did not hit him again. He simply held the writhing, cursing man down, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. It was over in 5 seconds. It was the stark difference between Riker's mindless violence and Luke's focused, dispassionate justice. In the ringing silence that followed, all eyes turned to Silas MacCready. He stood alone, his lawyer having backed away, his hired guns making no move to help him. He was exposed, his power revealed as nothing more than a fragile shell. The crowd, his neighbors, the people he had tried to ruin, stared at him with open contempt. The justice of the peace found his voice, pointing a trembling finger at the disgraced land baron. "Silas MacCready, I am placing you under arrest." As Luke hauled a defeated Boone Riker to his feet and others rushed to help the wounded deputy, a single beam of morning sun broke through the dusty window of the town hall. It cut through the gloom, illuminating the swirling dust motes in the air. A golden spear of light that seemed to fall directly on the open pages of the survey ledger. The truth, buried in an iron box and hidden by lies, had finally, violently, been brought into the light. The chaos of the town hall gave way to a stunned, sober quiet. Silas MacCready, stripped of his power and prestige in a single, violent moment, was led away by the justice of the peace and 2 deputized citizens. He did not look at the crowd, at the faces of the people he had tried to ruin. He walked like a man already in a prison of his own making, his expensive suit looking hollow and ill-fitting. His downfall was not loud, but a quiet, complete evaporation of the fear he had so carefully cultivated. Boone Riker, cradling his broken wrist and his shattered pride, was a different matter. Faced with the certainty of a long prison sentence for attempted murder of a lawman, his animal cunning took over. In the dusty confines of the deputy's office, he confessed. It was not a confession of remorse, but a torrent of bitter, self-serving truths, a final, desperate act to lessen his own fate. He laid bare the entire conspiracy, from the stolen ledger and the hired surveyor to the arson at the warehouse and the deliberate framing of Abigail. He sacrificed his master to save himself, a final, fitting act of treachery. Deputy Tabor, his arm bound tightly in a sling, his face pale but his eyes clear and hard, took down every word. When he looked up from his notes, the boyish uncertainty that had plagued him was gone forever. He had taken a bullet in the line of duty, a painful but profound baptism. He was no longer a man caught between pressures. He was the law, and he intended to act like it. The next day, a kind of communal energy, long suppressed, took hold of the valley. It was Jed Miller who started it, riding from homestead to homestead. There was no official order, no legal decree, just a shared understanding. With axes, shovels, and teams of mules, the men of the valley rode to the illegal dam. Luke was there, his movements stiff from his ordeal in the flood, but his purpose unwavering. They worked together, men who had previously been too frightened to even speak Macready's name in a whisper, and they tore that dam apart. Abigail stood on the canyon rim, watching them. She saw them chop through the logs, pry the rocks loose, and breach the packed earth. And then came the moment of release. The water, the lifeblood of the valley, surged through the gap. It was not the raging, destructive torrent of the flash flood, but a steady, joyful rush, the sound of a promise being kept. It flowed down the dry creek bed, filling the gullies and washes, turning the parched earth dark and rich. It was a baptism for the land itself. In the following weeks, as the wheels of territorial justice slowly turned, a different kind of healing began. The women of the homesteads began to visit Abigail's small, half-finished cabin. They came bearing gifts, a jar of peaches, a sack of flour, a dozen fresh eggs. One afternoon, Mary Miller came with Senora Ruiz and 2 other women. They carried not food, but bundles of fabric. "Every woman in the valley gave a piece," Mary said, her eyes shining as she laid a scrap of blue gingham on Abigail's small table. "This was from my son's first shirt." Another woman added a piece of faded calico, "from my wedding dress." Soon the table was covered in a mosaic of colors and patterns, each a small, silent piece of a family's history. Senora Ruiz, her hands gnarled but her movements graceful, gathered them up. "In the old way," she said, her voice soft but resonant, "a new home is not built only with wood and stone. It must be woven with the lives of the community. A quilt is not just for warmth. Abigail, it is a promise. It says, 'Your joys are our joys, and your sorrows are ours as well.' It says, 'You are one of us now.'" Abigail looked at the scraps of cloth, at the faces of the women around her, and felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. She had come to this land seeking sanctuary, a place to be alone. Instead, she had found a family, a home woven from the threads of shared struggle and mutual trust. Luke had been working alongside her every day, helping her finish the cabin. They worked in a comfortable, easy silence, but the air between them was charged with the unspoken things that had passed by the river. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the nearly completed cabin, watching the sunset, he finally spoke of it. He did not turn to look at her. He just watched the sky bleed from orange to purple. "This cabin," he said, his voice a low rumble, "it is a good, strong cabin. It will stand against the wind." He paused, then turned to her, his gaze direct and serious. A person should not have to stand against the wind alone. Not anymore. It was not a flowery proposal. It was a statement of fact, a truth as solid and unadorned as the man himself. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. "No," she said, her voice a whisper. "They should not." They were married a week later, on the same bend in the river where he had found her bathing. It was not a grand affair. The only church was the vast blue sky, and the only music was the sound of the water and the wind in the cottonwoods. The entire community was there, their faces scrubbed, their best clothes worn and mended. Jed Miller stood with his family, his son looking at Luke with open adoration. Deputy Tabor was there, his arm still in a sling, but a broad, genuine smile on his face. Senora Ruiz stood before them, her silver hair glowing in the late afternoon sun. She did not read from a book. She spoke from the heart, of the land, of the water that gives life, of the strength it takes to plant roots in hard soil, and of the courage it takes to let another soul into the fenced-off pastures of the heart. As Luke and Abigail exchanged their simple vows, Zadie Bell began to sing. She did not sing a saloon tune. She sang a quiet, soulful spiritual, her voice a river of deep, resonant emotion that flowed over the small congregation, speaking of trials and deliverance, of finding a home in a weary land. It was a song of pure, unvarnished hope. When the vows were done, Naylan, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, a silent, watchful presence, stepped forward. He went to Luke's buckskin horse, which was tethered nearby. From a small leather pouch, he took a single, bright red thread. With deft, practiced fingers, He tied the thread around the saddle horn. He looked at Luke and Abigail and gave a single, solemn nod. Senora Ruiz leaned over and whispered to Abigail, "It is an old blessing, for a long journey, that your path may always be safe and you will never be lost to each other." Just then, as if in response to the blessing, the first drop of rain fell, then another and another. It was not a storm, but a soft, gentle shower, the first rain of the season. It speckled the dust, releasing the rich, clean scent of petrichor, the smell of life returning to the thirsty earth. It fell on their faces, mingling with the happy tears on Mary Miller's cheeks. And it felt like a benediction, a final, cleansing absolution from the heavens, washing away the grit and the sorrow of the past, leaving only the promise of a new beginning. Later that night, they returned to their small, new home. The rain whispered on the new shingled roof, a soft, peaceful rhythm. A single lantern cast a warm, golden glow on the log walls. Lying on their simple bed was the quilt, a testament to the community that had embraced them, its myriad colors and patterns a map of their shared lives. Luke reached out and gently touched the scar on her shoulder, his fingers tracing the old wound not with pity, but with a tender reverence, an acknowledgement of the battles she had fought to get here. She looked at him, at the quiet strength in his eyes, at the man who had faced down her ghosts and his own, and knew that she was finally, truly, home. The rain fell, the lantern glowed, and in the small, quiet cabin, a new life began, not with a fire, but with a gentle, healing warmth. A year passed. The land, like a heart that has been broken and then mended, began to show its resilience. The valley floor, once a patchwork of dusty brown and struggling green, was now a broad blanket of gold. The barley stood tall and heavy-headed, swaying in the afternoon breeze, a testament to the free-flowing water and the collective labor of the homesteaders. The scar of the illegal dam was still visible if you knew where to look, a faint, pale line in the canyon, but it was being slowly reclaimed by rabbit brush and grama grass, a memory losing its power with every season. The sound of children's laughter now echoed from a small sodden timber building that stood near Abigail's cottonwood tree. It was the Larkspur Valley School, inside. Abigail stood before a large slate, her hands dusty with chalk, a smudge on her cheek that she was unaware of. The 7 students she had started with had grown to 12, a boisterous, bright-eyed collection of the valley's future. They were learning their sums and letters, but Abigail taught them more. She taught them the history of the land they lived on, the names of the plants that grew wild, and the stories of people who had the courage to build something new. Just as the lesson ended, the children's attention shifted to the doorway. Luke stood there, leaning against the frame, his hat in his hands. A slow, easy smile touched his lips, a sight that was no longer a rarity, but a part of the daily landscape of Abigail's life. The children cheered. The end of the school day meant the beginning of another lesson. Outside, in the small corral they had built, Luke became the teacher. He was patient and firm, his voice never rising, yet commanding the complete attention of every child. He taught them not just how to ride, but how to understand the animals, how to be gentle with the reins and firm with their legs. He was giving them a skill essential for survival in this vast land, but he was also giving them a piece of himself, his quiet confidence, his respect for the living world. Abigail watched from the schoolhouse doorway, her heart full. They were a partnership, a team, each planting different seeds in the same fertile ground. Larkspur had changed, too. The corrosive influence of Silas McCready had been excised like a tumor, and in its place, something healthier had begun to grow. Deputy Tabor, his shoulder fully healed, now wore the star of a United States Marshal. The bullet he had taken had earned him not just a promotion, but the unwavering respect of the townspeople. He enforced the law with a quiet, unshakable fairness that Larkspur had never known. Zadie Bell was no longer a singer in a saloon. She had taken the reward money offered for McCready's conviction and, with a loan from some of the more prosperous and grateful ranchers, had bought the old mercantile building. She had transformed it into Zadie's tea and supper house, a clean, well-lit establishment that served hot meals, fresh bread, and no whiskey. It became the new heart of the town, a place for families and quiet conversation, its windows glowing with a welcoming light long after the silver star had descended into its nightly cacophony. As for their enemies, justice had been slow but absolute. Silas McCready was serving a long sentence in the territorial prison for fraud and conspiracy, his name already becoming a cautionary tale told to children. Boone Riker, having confessed to everything in exchange for a lesser charge, had been sent to a federal prison far to the east, a place with high stone walls and no horizon, a fitting punishment for a man who had only ever understood the law of open spaces and brute force. One evening, as the shadows lengthened and the valley was bathed in the soft, honeyed light of dusk, Abigail sat at the small wooden desk Luke had built for her. Their cabin was a home now, filled with the small comforts of a shared life. The quilt, a vibrant tapestry of their community, was spread across the bed. The air was still and warm, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant, contented lowing of Luke's cattle. She dipped a pen in a pot of ink, her other hand resting on the gentle, unmistakable swell of her belly. She was writing a letter, though its recipient would not be able to read it for many years to come. "To my child," she began, the ink flowing smoothly across the page. She paused, looking out the open window at the vast, peaceful landscape. How could she explain the journey that had led them here? She wrote of Missouri, not with bitterness, but as a lesson in the fragility of a reputation and the strength it takes to start anew. She described the dust and the fear of her first days in Larkspur, a town held in the grip of a powerful man's greed. She wrote of the fire, the planted knife, and the whispers that had threatened to suffocate her before she had even taken a full breath of this new, dry air. She wrote of a quiet, guarded man who had offered her not pity, but a shared belief in a straight fence line. She described their days of labor under the hot sun, the slow, unspoken building of trust between two lonely souls who had both learned to be wary of happiness. She wrote of the river, of the desperate flight through the sandstorm, of the terrifying, cleansing power of the flash flood that had, in its fury, unearthed the very truth they sought. She filled the pages with the names of the people who had become their family. Senora Ruiz, with her ancient wisdom; Nalin, whose silent loyalty was as solid as the mountains; Marshal Tabar, who had found his courage when it mattered most; and Zadie, whose beautiful, brave voice had spoken a truth that had set them all free. She wrote of the wedding, of the gentle rain that had felt like a blessing, and of the community that had woven them into its very fabric with scraps of calico and gingham. She looked down at her hand, resting on the life growing within her. "Your father," she wrote, "will teach you to ride, to read the clouds for rain, and to be true to your word. He is a man who speaks little, but whose actions have rebuilt my world. He will show you that strength is not in the loudness of a man's voice, but in the quiet conviction of his heart." Luke came in as she was finishing, his boots soft on the wooden floor. He did not ask what she was writing. He simply came up behind her and rested his hands on her shoulders, his touch warm and familiar. He looked down at the letter, then at her. "The sun is setting," he said softly. "Let us ride down to the river." They rode together, their horses moving at a slow, easy walk. The air was cool now, and the sky was a masterpiece of deep, velvety blues and fiery streaks of orange. They followed the creek, its banks lush and green, its water running clear and steady. It was no longer a symbol of conflict, but the peaceful, beating heart of their valley. They stopped on a low bluff overlooking the Rio del Bravo, the same place where they had camped after the storm. The river flowed before them, a wide silver ribbon in the fading light, moving unimpeded toward the sea. Luke reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. They did not need to speak. The silence between them was full of everything they had overcome, and everything that lay ahead. Abigail looked at the free-flowing water, at the vast, peaceful land spread before them, at the strong, gentle man beside her. She thought of the child she carried, a child who would be born into this world of earned peace. She squeezed Luke's hand, and the final words of her letter echoed in her mind, a truth she had learned not from a book, but from the very soil beneath her feet. In the West, we do not find happiness, we sow it, water it with sweat, and keep it with our word. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help us share this story with more people.